She was used to walking down the same street every day, her steps slow but steady. The morning wind ruffled her worn coat, and eyes rarely lingered on her. Until that Tuesday, something different happened. A luxury car stopped right in front of her. The tinted window rolled down slowly, revealing a man with a hard expression. He wasn't just any stranger. Everyone in town had heard of him, the millionaire who had turned businesses into gold, but who carried a reputation for being cold and ruthless. As she prepared to cross the street, she felt those eyes measuring her up and down. They weren't eyes of curiosity, but of judgment, and that made her heart pound. Have you ever felt so small, but then everything changed? This story will show you how even a chance encounter can become a turning point. Thank you for watching this video until the end, and may our Almighty Father, God bless you with good health and joy, and may He fulfill all your heart's dreams, just as He fulfills all mine. And if you enjoy stories like this full of emotion and hope, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss the next chapters of this incredible journey. She pretended not to be bothered, but the truth was that his heavy presence stirred her. She tried to move forward, keeping her head high, but felt the weight of an awkward silence. The millionaire didn't say anything immediately. He just watched her with a mixture of contempt and curiosity, as if testing her limits deep down. She already knew that this man had enough power to transform anyone's life, for better or for worse, but she never imagined he would use that power precisely to humiliate someone so simple. The air felt colder, and the streets suddenly felt too small for the two of them. It was as if two completely different worlds had collided. Hers simple, filled with small gestures of faith and kindness. His, laden with luxury, haste, and vanity. The scene felt like one of those old movies where a seemingly banal encounter changed entire destinies. And indeed it did. Memories of her childhood came to mind at that moment. Mornings in the kitchen with her mother, the smell of fresh coffee, the prayers before leaving the house. It gave her strength. But before that arrogant gaze, even her memories seemed small. Who was she to be noticed by someone so wealthy? The millionaire, on the other hand, wasn't used to being ignored, and seeing that simple lady with her steady, serene gaze awakened something in him. It wasn't respect, at least not yet. It was irritation. How dare someone so ordinary behave with dignity in his presence? There was something about him that seemed to seek conflict, as if he needed to reaffirm his superiority over the world. She, on the other hand, simply wanted to cross the street in peace. But God has mysterious ways of conducting encounters, and this wouldn't be just another day. It would be the beginning of an unexpected turn. The city seemed frozen for a moment. Passersby watched from afar, unwilling to intervene. There was an invisible tension in the air, as if everyone knew something momentous was about to happen. No one imagined the weight those next words would carry. He finally opened his mouth. His deep voice cut through the silence, thick with sarcasm. It wasn't a greeting nor a question. It was a sentence that cut like a blade. People like you should be grateful just to be on this street. Her world stopped for a second. Her heart beat faster, but she took a deep breath. She remembered the words of Scripture. The Lord is my refuge and strength. This gave her courage not to shrink from the insult. Her eyes lifted, and for the first time she looked the arrogant millionaire in the eye. There was an invisible shock. He expected submission but found firmness, and this unexpected reaction bothered him even more. How could someone so simple not bow before his power? He shifted in the car seat, irritated, but also curious. She didn't say anything, right? Away. She just kept her eyes fixed on him with a serenity that disarmed any insult. There was something sacred about this calm. Something he couldn't understand. And that was when, without knowing it, he began to lose the battle. He thought he was winning. The cold wind blew, as if nature itself were witnessing this unlikely encounter. A car honked in the background, breaking the heavy silence. But nothing could distract from the scene. An ordinary woman facing a man who thought himself untouchable. It was a silent duel of souls. Her eyes conveyed something no amount of money could buy: dignity. This deeply bothered the millionaire. He was used to controlling situations with wealth and power, but here, none of that seemed to work. It was as if his pride had encountered its first real barrier. She took a deep breath and, in her mind, asked God for strength, not to humiliate that man, but to keep her own soul from being shaken. She knew that human humiliations don't define who we are, but even so, she had no idea how much that encounter would shape their future. The millionaire fiddled with his gold watch impatiently. His discomfort was evident. He wanted to end the scene with one final word of contempt, but something was holding him back. There was a strange force in her silence, as if something greater was in control. The street returned to its normal hustle and bustle. People hurried past, pretending not to notice the collision. But for her, time still seemed suspended. A part of her soul sensed This wasn't just a coincidence. It was the beginning of something yet to unfold. As she finally crossed the street, she felt the weight of his gaze still on her back. It wasn't just contempt. There was a strange mix of irritation and doubt. The millionaire wasn't used to losing control, but somehow he had doubt in her heart. A disturbing feeling remained. It wasn't fear, nor just sadness. It was as if God had allowed this encounter for a greater reason, a reason she didn't understand at the time. But her faith told her that everything had a purpose. Across the street, she paused for a moment. She glanced back and saw the car still stopped, as if it simply couldn't move forward. Their eyes met again. His filled with pride, hers filled with calm. And in that instant, something invisible happened. A seed was planted, not in her heart, which was already fertile in faith, but in his, hardened by years of arrogance. A seed that would germinate in due time, bearing fruits no one could have foreseen. She continued on her way, trying to shake the memory of what she had just heard. But it was impossible. Words carry weight, and that cruel sentence echoed in her mind. At the same time, something inside her said, "This isn't the end. This will come back." In the car, the millionaire suddenly accelerated as if to escape an internal discomfort, but try as he might, he couldn't shake the image of that woman. That firm posture, that unwavering gaze, he would never forget it. The two went their separate ways, seemingly separate. She to her simple routine, he to his life of luxury. But there was an invisible thread connecting them now. A thread woven not by chance but by something greater. And, as always, life had its own plans. Plans that didn't depend on human pride or apparent simplicity. Plans that would unite these two worlds again, in a way no one dared imagine. The unexpected encounter had happened, and with it, the beginning of a story that still held many surprises. The silence of that morning would turn into cries of regret in the future, but for now, the journey had only just begun. On that sunny afternoon, the central square was bustling with people. Children chased pigeons, vendors offered ice-cold lemonade, and elderly men relaxed on wooden benches. It was a peaceful scene, typical of a small American town. But within seconds, that place would become the stage for something no one would forget. The millionaire arrived in his luxurious pickup truck, its windows gleaming in the sun. People immediately noticed his presence. He liked this, the power to be seen, talked about, admired, or even feared. And when his eyes met the same simple woman again, fate seemed to conspire. She was there simply to buy bread at a nearby bakery, a common gesture, typical of a life without luxuries. But the millionaire saw the scene as an opportunity to reaffirm his superiority, as if humiliating someone so humble in front of everyone were an invisible trophy. He approached his steps, firm, a wry smile on his face. The crowd noticed and fell silent. It was as if everyone knew something bad was about to happen, but no one dared stop it. The light atmosphere in the square changed to an almost suffocating tension. In a loud voice, he began to mock her simple attire. He commented on her worn coat and her old shoes as if they were a source of shame. The nervous laughter of some around only heightened the weight of the humiliation. It was as if everyone was frozen between fear and curiosity. She clutched the bag of bread to her chest, trying to remain calm. Her heart was racing, but her soul silently cried out, "Lord, give me strength." She didn't want to cry there, nor give him the pleasure of seeing her tears. She needed to remain strong, even in the face of such cruelty. He didn't stop there. He asked if she had the money to pay for what she was carrying, insinuating that perhaps she'd taken it without being able to. It was a low blow, cruel, unfair. The audience was divided. Some were embarrassed in silence. Others laughed to please the millionaire. It felt like the whole world had turned against her. But amidst the pain, a reminder flashed through her mind. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. This promise kept her from breaking down right there in the face of their cruel gazes. A young man named Daniel even tried to intervene, but the millionaire's cold gaze made him retreat. He too feared becoming a target of that sharp tongue, and so the humiliation continued. With no one having the courage to stop the cruel spectacle, it was as if the millionaire needed to feed off other people's discomfort. With each word, his tone grew more arrogant. "People like you should be grateful just to have a seat in this square," he said, with a laugh that echoed deep in her heart. Her face began to flush, but not from embarrassment. It was from indignation. Even without saying anything, her eyes conveyed a clear message. "You can humiliate me before the world, but you can't take away my dignity." This silent firmness began to disconcert some onlookers. A woman watching from afar murmured, "This isn't right." But her voice was drowned out by the general silence. No one dared challenge the millionaire. And the simple woman, still standing, seemed to bear the brunt of the storm alone. The bread in her hands became almost a symbol. The food of life, so simple, was now a source of mockery, but she knew that the true bread that sustained her soul came from another source. This certainty strengthened her from within, even when everything outside seemed to be crumbling. The millionaire then took an even crueler step. He asked if anyone there wanted to help the poor thing. It was like rubbing salt in the wound. The murmur of the crowd grew. Some laughed, others looked away in shame. She remained motionless. His thoughts turned to the cross. Jesus had also been humiliated before everyone, and yet he did not retaliate. That memory gave him the courage to endure the moment. Because deep down he knew that God's justice does not fail, even when human justice fails. He tried to elicit a reaction from her. He expected tears, screams, despair. But he couldn't. Her silence was stronger than all his words, and this began to bother him in an unexpected way. The audience could sense it too. There was something different about this woman. Suddenly, a small child tugged at her mother's skirt and asked loudly, "Why is he so mean?" The innocent comment cut through the air like a knife. Some smiled awkwardly, others coughed to hide it. But the truth was already exposed. Even a child could sense the cruelty. The millionaire tried to laugh off his discomfort, but the scene had lost its power. He was still the rich and powerful man, but now he bore the brunt of everyone's curious and judgmental gaze. Deep down, he was beginning to feel a strange sensation. He was losing something money couldn't buy. She finally raised her voice, but not to attack him. Firmly and tenderly, she simply said, "God knows every heart." They were simple words, but spoken with such conviction that silence spread across the square. The millionaire hadn't expected that. People held their breath, as if waiting for an explosive response from him. But for a moment he just stared at her, surprised. That sentence resonated deeper than he cared to admit. Something in his conscience was touched, even if he denied it. The weight of that scene didn't end there. The woman continued forward, walking, slowly, unbowed by humiliation. Her dignified posture left a silent trail of respect. Some applauded discreetly, others simply followed her with their eyes. The millionaire stood there, uncomfortable. He hadn't won, even though he held all the power in that square. The woman's silence had spoken louder than all his insults, and this invisible defeat began to erode his pride as he tried to regain his superiority. His mind was already working silently. Something was troubling him. Who was this woman, after all, who wouldn't break before his arrogance? This question would haunt him in the days that followed. She returned home with a heavy heart, but not broken. She knew that humiliations are part of the journey. But within her, there was a flame that could not be extinguished. The certainty that God had seen every detail. That night she knelt in prayer. She asked not only for strength to carry on, but also for mercy for the man who had hurt her. This act, which few would understand, would be the key to everything that would come after. Meanwhile, the millionaire tried to sleep in his luxurious mansion, but the silence in the room was heavy. Her words returned to him like a disturbing echo. God knows every heart. He tossed and turned restless. The town was buzzing. Some criticized his cruelty, others applauded her firmness. But no one remained indifferent. That public scene had left its mark on everyone, and, deep down, it was merely paving the way for something much greater in her heart. There was pain, yes, but there was also hope. Hope that one day, somehow, this story would have a greater purpose. And, unbeknownst to her, she was about to see that purpose revealed. The public humiliation wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a transformation no one expected. Not her, not him, not the city. But God's ways always surprise. And there was still much more to come. The next morning, the sun shone as usual, but for her, nothing seemed the same. The square, filled with laughter, was no longer just a public space. It was a place that held a wound, a painful memory that throbbed inside her chest as if burned. She left the house to do her simple tasks, but she felt the stares. Some filled with compassion, others with curiosity. And even without words, she knew the scene in the square had spread throughout the city. The humiliation hadn't just remained in the air. It had entered the people's conversations. Her heart was still heavy. But in her prayer that morning, she asked only for courage. Not to forget what happened, but so that the pain wouldn't turn. Her bitter, because she knew, invisible wounds left untreated, corrode the soul faster than visible cuts. As she walked back to the bakery, her steps seemed slower. Every corner reminded her of the previous scene. The millionaire's ironic laughter still echoed in her mind, as if it had always been there. But she took a deep breath and remembered Jesus' words. "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer." The bakery lady, Mary, greeted her with a shy smile. She tried to hide it, but her eyes held pity. "How are you, dear?" she asked softly. She responded with a small smile, but the silence that followed spoke volumes. Back home, every ordinary gesture felt different. putting water to boil, arranging flowers in a vase, folding clean clothes. Everything carried the weight of memory, but it was there in the silence of her home that she most felt God's presence strengthening her. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, but inside, the pain was present. Invisible wounds leave no stains on the body, but deeply mark the soul. And silently, she carried a scar that no one saw. But that would change her path. That night, as she opened her Bible, her eyes fell on the psalm that said, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted." It was like a balm on her wounds, a reminder that even in the midst of pain, she was not alone. Meanwhile, the millionaire was living the opposite. Surrounded by parties, expensive cars, and fawning people, he seemed intact. But the truth is that, even within him subtly something had begun to hurt. An inner voice that accused him, a wound that, at first he refused to acknowledge. However, her wounds were more pronounced. Walking through the city was now a challenge. Some whispered as she passed, as if commenting on the scene again. Others gave her looks of pity. It was as if the humiliation were repeated, day after day, without him being present. But there was something different about her. It wasn't the kind of pain that destroys. It was the kind that strengthens. She knew that God allows trials to shape us. And even if no one understood, this invisible wound would be a stepping stone to something greater in church. Sitting in the last pew, she closed her eyes and let the tears flow. No one needed to know. They were tears that washed the soul, that delivered the pain to the only one who could truly heal. There, in silence, she found the strength to carry on. A neighbor named Susan approached and tried to comfort her. She told her it would pass, that people would forget. But she knew it wasn't about forgetting, it was about transformation. The wound needed to become a lesson, not just a bitter memory. From time to time, she would find herself thinking, "Why me?" But then she would remember the words she had repeated so often in her youth, "Thy will be done." This submission, even through tears, was what kept her going. The simple life continued. The old stove, the rocking chair on the porch, the birds singing at dawn. Nothing had changed on the outside, but inside, something was different. The invisible wounds had begun to shape an even stronger faith. Meanwhile, in his mansion, the millionaire was also having difficult nights. The silence brought him no peace. He tried to distract himself with music, drinks, and conversation, but deep down, the scene in the square kept returning. That woman's serene gaze haunted him like a mirror. The difference was clear. While she sought healing in God, he tried to hide his own wound behind riches. But the truth is, no one escapes conscience. Sooner or later, the wounds we pretend don't exist end. As part of her routine, she began writing short sentences in a notebook. Forgiving isn't forgetting, it's trusting. God sees beyond what meets the eye. These notes were reminders that her pain wasn't in vain. One day, while walking through the market, he overheard two women whispering about the scene in the square. One said she felt ashamed of him. The other said she felt sorry for her. The woman took a deep breath and thought, "My story doesn't end here." These invisible wounds were like seeds planted in her heart. They hurt, yes, but they also paved the way for something yet to come, something neither she nor the city, nor the millionaire himself could have foreseen. Sometimes at night, she would gaze up at the starry sky and remember that God knows every detail. He even counts the stars and calls each one by name. She would murmur, "If he cares for the stars, why wouldn't he care for her?" This certainty lulled her to sleep. Days turned into weeks, but the memory wouldn't fade. Still, her grief began to transform into compassion. And, surprisingly, she began to pray not just for herself, but for the millionaire himself. It was an unthinkable gesture for many, who would pray for someone who humiliated them in front of everyone. But she knew that true love doesn't choose who deserves it. You pray because God taught us to love even our enemies. And it was there, in the silence of the early morning hours, that she began to discover that her invisible wounds could be her greatest strength. They didn't stop her from living. On the contrary, they taught her to live more deeply. People around her were still talking. Some said she should fight back, others that she should sue. But she remained steadfast, believing that God's justice is greater than any human court. This trust didn't eliminate the pain, but it gave it meaning. Every tear shed in prayer seemed to be collected by invisible hands, and this brought rest to her soul. Meanwhile, the millionaire's seemingly intact. Life was already beginning to show cracks. Bad decisions, risky business deals, sleepless nights. He didn't know it yet, but his own invisible wounds were about to open in her heart. However, there was a silent hope that one day, somehow, that pain would transform into something greater. A wound can be a sign of weakness, but it can also be a scar of victory. The invisible wounds weren't the end. They were just preparation, because what no one imagined was that life was about to be turned upside down. For her, for him, and for everyone who witnessed that story. On one side of the city, her simple home stood like a haven of peace. A small garden with flowers tended by loving hands welcomed those passing by on the sidewalk. The wooden porch, already worn by time, held stories of laughter, tears, and silent prayers. It was a humble home, but full of human warmth. On the other side, the millionaire's mansion gleamed like a modern palace. Its imposing facade, imported cars in the garage, and a swimming pool lit up at night, everything screamed power, status, and wealth. But behind the high walls lay a cold, soulless, rootless silence while she prepared breakfast of scrambled eggs and plain toast. He received elaborate dishes prepared by chefs, but the difference wasn't just in the taste, it was in the ambience. In her kitchen, there were laughter, memories, and prayers. In his, only the sound of silverware and vibrating cell phones. The contrast between their worlds was stark. She, accustomed to saving pennies to buy the necessities. He, accustomed to spending thousands in a single night without missing a beat. But there was something not even all his money could buy. The peace that lived in her heart at the supermarket. She chose each item carefully, taking advantage of coupons and promotions. Sometimes she'd leave something in her cart to stay within budget. He, on the other hand, would send assistants to get whatever he wanted, never checking the prices. But despite this, the emptiness in his heart remained. The old sofa in her living room was worn but warm. Their grandchildren jumped, grown children rested, and the Bible sat open on the coffee table. Meanwhile, in his living room, expensive sofas and huge TVs filled the space. But no one truly filled the silence. At night, she would sit on the porch, listening to the crickets and giving thanks for the day. Small things were reasons for gratitude. The rain that watered the garden, a son's phone call, the abundant food. He, on the other hand, always sought more. A bigger party, a more expensive trip, a newer car. Nothing was enough. Her clothes were simple, but always clean and carefully pressed. His were designer clothes, bought in New York or Los Angeles. But the thing is, when she looked in the mirror, she saw dignity. When he looked at himself, he saw only the image he wanted to sell to the world. In her heart, faith was a treasure. No matter how little she had, she always believed that God would provide what she needed. He, even with so much, lived in fear of loss, fear that everything would fall apart. And silently, this fear was already beginning to become reality. Her neighbors knew her by name. They knew her stories, shared her laughter and hardships. In his mansion, however, neighbors barely spoke, hidden behind high fences. The isolation of luxury was as cold as the marble hallways he walked through every day. When she was sick, she received homemade soups, visits, and prayers. When he fell ill once, he had renowned doctors but no real visitors. The people around him were quick to serve but slow to care. She knew how to fix loose buttons and improvise recipes with whatever she had. He discarded what no longer fit, bought new, and replaced things without a second thought. The difference wasn't just in their possessions, but in their outlook on life. While she spent her time caring for her family, he spent his time caring for his image. Photos, public appearances, business ventures that fed his ego. But in the silence of the night, they both knew exactly what they had. She, a home. He, just a house. The contrast also manifested itself in her dreams. Hers was simple. Seeing her children happy, her family united, her faith transmitted. His was grandiose, accumulating more, expanding his business, being recognized beyond the city's borders. But, ironically, she was the one who had the most to offer. On Sundays, she walked to church with a calm step, carrying a Bible worn from overuse. When he appeared at an event, he wore expensive suits, but he carried an emptiness that no amount of clothing could hide. In her eyes, there was light. In his, there was shadow. She told stories to her grandchildren at the bedside, using her own life as an example of faith and resilience. He crunched numbers on spreadsheets, always worried about the next negotiation. But the numbers didn't bring the comfort of a heartfelt laugh. Her table had simple chairs, but was always full of people. His had luxurious chairs, but was almost always empty. And it's curious how tables reveal secrets. Hers was a place for sharing, his, a place for silence. In her backyard, there were flowers cultivated with love. In his garden, there were expensive flowers, but planted by hired gardeners. One showed life, the other merely appearance. And the difference was clear to anyone who looked closely. While she saved up for Christmas gifts, he oversold them lavishly, packaged but devoid of meaning. Her joy came from seeing the recipient's eyes light up. His joy ended as soon as the colorful paper was torn. On winter days, she would wrap herself in old blankets and be grateful for the warmth of her home. It had modern heaters and automatic fireplaces, but she still felt cold inside. The contrast wasn't in the weather, but in her soul. She collected letters, photographs, and mementos. He collected contracts, properties, and figures, but at the end of the day, her treasures warmed her. His only pressed her down. Because memories are worth more than numbers, and he didn't understand that yet. Her children called to check on her. His associates called to demand decisions. The difference between affection and interest was clear. And the more he accumulated, the more distant he became from what really mattered. She saw God in the little things, in the sunset, in the smell of baking bread, in the embrace of a grandchild. She sought rational explanations, contracts, and numbers. But deep down, she missed something she couldn't name. The contrast was so great that it seemed impossible that their worlds would ever intersect again. But life has mysterious ways of bringing together stories that, at first glance, should never meet. And this contrast would one day reveal their greatest lesson. She stood firm, trusting that even in differences there was purpose. He remained lost, unaware that his fortress of luxury was more fragile than he'd imagined. Fate was already preparing the next chapter in this story. Her world seemed small, but it was full of grandeur. His seemed grand, but it was full of emptiness. And one day they would both be forced to face this truth, face to face. The contrast between worlds wasn't just material, it was spiritual. It was the chasm between living with purpose and living by appearances. And this chasm would soon become unsustainable because life always finds a way to balance the scales. And in that balance, the millionaire's pride would be tested like never before, and the simple woman's faith would shine even brighter. Life has a curious way of turning pages when we least expect it. For the millionaire, the glory days seemed endless. But a silent storm was already brewing in his business. Arrogance prevented him from realizing that each rash decision sowed the seeds of his downfall while he boasted about yet another investment. Discreet reports pointed to losses. Partners grumbled, employees feared the future. But the millionaire believed himself invincible. After all, until that moment, everything he touched turned to gold. At least, that's what he thought. One morning, he received a call that would change the course of everything. A crucial partnership had been severed. Within minutes, millions had evaporated from his empire. For the first time in a long time, he felt the ground shake beneath his feet. He tried to mask his insecurity with more parties, more cars, more trips, but the emptiness only grew, and the news continued to worsen. Investors pulled away, debts mounted. It was like sand slipping through his hands, impossible to hold back. Meanwhile, the simple woman went about her daily life. There were no luxuries, but there was stability. Small victories like a bill paid on time or a meal shared with family brought her more joy than any bank balance could. The contrast between them began to reverse. She, firm in her faith, remained standing even amidst painful memories. He, surrounded by everything money could buy, was increasingly broken inside. One night, the millionaire was seen alone, walking through the same square where he had humiliated his wife. That space had previously been a stage for his arrogance. Now, it was the scene of his solitude. The silence of the square seemed to accuse him without a word. He tried to convince himself it was just a phase. But deep down, he knew something deeper was happening. It wasn't just financial bankruptcy that threatened him. It was a bankruptcy of the soul. One of his closest partners, tired of his mistakes, decided to abandon him. It was like losing a part of his own empire. The pillars that supported his proud castle were crumbling one by one. Meanwhile, the simple woman was also going through hardships. But there was a difference. Her hardships brought her even closer to God. She knew that every tear shed in prayer was transformed into strength. He, on the other hand, was still running away from the only source of real comfort. The city began to notice the change. The man who had once flaunted power now walked with his head down, and the woman who had been humiliated remained firm and serene. Fate seemed to reverse roles before everyone's eyes. He lost businesses, cars, and trips. Little by little, the people around him began to disappear too. He discovered what many already know. When the money runs out, the flattery disappears, and the silence is deafening. Amidst his downfall, he tried to find answers through his own methods, but nothing worked. No investment panned out, no contacts opened doors. It was as if all exits were blocked. Meanwhile, she experienced small daily miracles. A seemingly impossible bill would be paid, a neighbor would show up with a basket of food, a son would call with good news. These were signs that God was watching over her in every detail. He began to lose sleep. In his luxurious room, he stared at the ceiling and asked himself, where did I go wrong? The memory of the simple woman returned like an insistent echo. Her gaze, steady and serene, haunted him. One early morning, he got up and walked to the window. Outside, the moon illuminated the expensive but empty garden, and silently, for the first time in a long time, he felt the urge to ask for help. But he didn't know how or from whom. The fall wasn't just external, it was internal. Wounded pride, a guilty conscience, unbearable loneliness. The millionaire was being stripped of everything he considered essential, and, without realizing it, he was being prepared for something greater. The simple woman also carried her invisible wounds, but amid them, she discovered a strength she never imagined she had. With each prayer, she felt as if she were being lifted higher, and this kept her strong even in the face of memories of humiliation. Local newspapers began to report his decline. Headlines that had previously extolled his achievements now announced bankruptcies. It was a public portrait of a decline that, for him, was unbearable. The man he had humiliated was now humiliated by life itself. He began to realize who truly cared. Few remained. Business friends disappeared. Parties emptied. And the echo of the square was still vivid in his memory. That scene came back with a vengeance. The woman, the silence, the dignity. One day, as he passed the same street where he had parked his car in front of her, he felt his heart sink. The world seemed to return every cruel word he had ever spoken. It was as if the city itself had become a mirror of his arrogance. With each fall, he remembered her more. Not for the pain she caused, but for the strength she demonstrated. That dignity was something he'd never possessed, despite all his power, and it began to awaken a strange thirst within him. He wanted to understand how someone so simple could remain standing while he, with so much, fell so quickly. It was as if there was an invisible force sustaining her, a force he didn't know but he was beginning to yearn for. Time passed and his life remained in ruins, but at the same time, his heart began to soften. For the first time in years, he felt the urge to look within himself, and that's when he began to realize the depth of the emptiness he carried. Meanwhile, the simple woman continued praying, and, unbeknownst to her, her words reached further than she imagined. She asked God to touch hearts, including his. A prayer that seemed impossible but was already beginning to be answered. Life's twists and turns were just beginning. The millionaire, who seemed untouchable, was being broken, and the woman who seemed fragile was being strengthened. Fate was heading toward the intersection of two opposing journeys. And in the silence of these twists and turns, life prepared the next step, because his fall wouldn't just be a fall. It would also be the beginning of something that would change them both forever. That silent night, she knelt beside her bed as she did every day. The room was simple, lit only by a small lamp, but it felt like a sanctuary. Her calloused hands clasped together and her eyes closed. The prayer began with gratitude, even amidst the pain. She remembered the humiliation, the invisible wounds, but instead of asking for revenge, she asked for mercy. Her soft voice said, "Lord, take care of his heart, as you have taken care of mine." It was a prayer that made no sense to many, but made perfect sense to heaven. Each word was like a seed planted in the invisible soil of faith. And she knew, sooner or later, flowers would grow from it. Tears flowed, but they were tears of trust, not despair. Her heart grew still each time she spoke God's name. On the small table in the living room, the Bible remained open to Romans, where she always read, "All things work together for good to those who love God." That promise was her foundation. Even when the whole world seemed to be falling apart, she knew she was not alone. Meanwhile, the millionaire in his mansion also knelt, but not out of devotion. It was desperation. He didn't know how to pray, didn't know what words to use. He simply placed his hands on his face and murmured, "If anyone hears me, help me." It was the first step of a broken heart. The difference between the two was clear. She prayed with faith, knowing that God heard her. He prayed without knowing if anyone was there to hear. But still, God was attentive. Because even a desperate whisper is heard by the Creator. With each dawn, she felt new strength. She might not have much money, she might carry emotional scars, but she had peace. A peace that came not from circumstances, but from the certainty that God was in control. In the kitchen, as the coffee brewed, she murmured prayers. She prayed for her children, her neighbors, even the strangers who passed by her street. Her life was woven with faith in every detail, and this invisible force sustained her soul. On the other side, the millionaire tried to imitate this gesture, but he felt ridiculous. He wasn't used to humbling himself, not even before God. However, when he closed his eyes, the memory of the simple woman would surface, and somehow this inspired him to try again. She, without knowing it, became an example even for him. Her silence, her firmness, the words spoken in the square, everything was like a sermon he couldn't forget. And her clumsy attempt to pray was a reflection of this. As the days passed, the woman noticed something different in her heart. Even though she didn't see any external changes, she felt her prayers were being answered. Not in immediate results, but in inner peace. And this peace was more valuable than any wealth. The millionaire, on the other hand, began to realize that money didn't bring answers. And increasingly, his soul yearned for something beyond what the world could offer. The emptiness pushed him. Into unknown territory, the search for God. In the church pew, she remained steadfast. Her knees, though weary with age, never stopped bending. There, in the silence of prayer, she found the strength to face each gaze, each painful memory, each difficult day. Meanwhile, he spent sleepless nights, until one morning he finally knelt for real, without masks, without pride. He cried like he hadn't cried in years. It was his first sincere prayer, and even without pretty words, God understood every tear. The power of prayer began to reveal itself. It wasn't just about asking, it was about surrendering. She surrendered her pain, he surrendered his pride. To such different paths, yet they would meet at the same destination. Her prayers didn't just change her life, they also changed the environment. Her children felt peace when they visited her. Neighbors found strength in talking to her. It was as if her home were a silent beacon that illuminated everyone around her. He, in turn, began to notice small answers. An unexpected conversation, advice from an unlikely source, a sudden relief amidst the chaos. These were signs that something bigger was at work. In her heart, there was one certainty. Prayer is never in vain. It may take time, it may not come as expected, but it always bears fruit. This conviction was what kept her smiling, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. The millionaire still resisted. He had days of faith and days of disbelief. But little by little, I realized that prayer was more powerful than any business plan, and every time I remembered it, I felt the urge to try again. One day, she got up early and walked to the porch. As she watched the sunrise, she whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for another chance." These small daily prayers were like invisible bricks building a fortress within her. That very morning, he was watching the sunrise from his glass window. For the first time, he thought to say thank you. He didn't know exactly to whom, but he said, "Thank you for still being alive." It was simple, but it was real. Her prayers continued to water seeds, and those seeds, little by little, germinated in his heart, even though he didn't know it. He was being reached by the words she spoke to the heavens. At a business meeting, he heard a partner say, "Sometimes, only God can help us." That simple phrase struck him like an arrow. It was as if the universe itself were answering the woman's silent prayers, without realizing it. She was already participating in his transformation, because prayer has this power. It reaches places our feet cannot. And in that moment, her words reached the millionaire's hardened heart. The invisible power of prayer was at work. A spiritual thread connected them. A link no one could see, but which guided every step, every thought, every decision. And little by little, he began to surrender. Not completely. There was still a struggle within him. But with each prayer, something broke. Until the inevitable would happen, he would have to seek forgiveness. She continued steadfastly, unaware of how much her example and her prayers had already changed history. Because prayer is like that. Silent, yet powerful. Invisible, yet transformative. His heart was about to bow down completely, and the bridge between pride and regret was already built. A bridge made of prayer. The millionaire was no longer the same haughty man who paraded through the city. His face bore the marks of sleepless nights, and his eyes, once filled with arrogance, now revealed a weight difficult to conceal. The fall had stripped away his masks. At every corner, memories came flooding back. The cruel laughter in the square, the sharp words, the woman's firm gaze. His conscience wouldn't let him rest. It was as if the city itself reminded him daily of its cruelty. He tried to justify himself, telling himself it was just a joke, that she wouldn't mind that much. But the excuse rang hollow. Deep down, he knew he'd hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and it ate at him. In the silence of the nearly empty mansion, he sat before the unlit fireplace. The walls reflected his solitude. No luxury could muffle the sound of his conscience. And it was in this silence that regret began to blossom. One night, he opened the drawer and found a Bible he'd received years ago but never read. He ran his fingers over the dusty cover. Unsure where to begin, he opened it at random. His eyes fell on a verse that read, "Confess your sins, and he is faithful and just to forgive you." The words hit him like an arrow. It was as if someone had written it specifically for him. For the first time, he truly cried. Not tears of anger or wounded pride, but tears of a broken heart. The next day, he tried to resume his business routine, but he couldn't. Papers, contracts, numbers, nothing made sense. Regret wouldn't leave him alone. It was as if everything that had once mattered had lost its value. The memory of the woman accompanied him with every step. Her silence, her words in the square, "God knows every heart." This phrase echoed in his mind as a reminder that he couldn't run away forever. He began to distance himself from his old party friends. He realized that nothing they offered could fill the void. Instead, it only intensified his guilt. He needed something different. He needed forgiveness, but asking for forgiveness wasn't easy. His pride still struggled within him. How could he face the woman he'd humiliated? How could he look into the eyes of someone he'd treated like nothing? The regret was there, but so was the fear of rejection. In the middle of the night, he would get up and pace around the house. Every hallway felt like an invisible courtroom. The guilt became unbearable. The belated regret was like a prison from which he could not escape. One day, he decided to go to church. He sat in the last pew, trying not to be noticed. He watched silently as people prayed, sang, and raised their hands. And deep down, he felt a pang of envy. He wished he had the same peace he saw in them. During the sermon, he heard words about forgiveness. The pastor said, "It's never too late to turn back. God's forgiveness is available even for the worst mistakes." He swallowed hard. It seemed to be directed directly at him. He left the church before the service ended, but the message lingered. In his heart, was it too late to fix it, or was there still hope? That question wouldn't leave him. On the way home, he passed the woman's street. He saw the simple porch, the flowers in the garden. His heart raced. He wanted to stop, but couldn't. The scene in the square was still a ghost. At home, he knelt once more. "Lord, if there's still a chance, show me how to ask for forgiveness." The words were simple but sincere. Repentance was no longer just remorse. It was a genuine desire to change. Days passed and the internal pressure mounted. Regret gave him no peace. He could no longer close deals or enjoy luxury. It was as if everything had lost its color. The city also noticed the change. The man who had once spoken loudly now walked silently. The ironic smile was gone. Many whispered, "He's not the same anymore." They were right. He wasn single quotes T. One day he ran into Daniel, the young man who had been in the square. Daniel said firmly, "You need to make things right. You can't run away forever." The simple words opened the wound even further, but they also showed the way. He knew he had to find her, but every time he thought about it, he felt a knot in his stomach, as if his own legs refused to carry him to her. His regret was strong, but his courage was still weak. However, there was no other way out. His belated repentance pushed him ever further forward. It was as if some invisible force were saying, "You will not have peace until you ask for forgiveness." One cold morning, he looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. His face was tired, his eyes sunken. "What have I become?" he murmured. The weight of his conscience was slowly destroying his health, and then he decided, no matter the shame, no matter what others would say, he had to face his mistake. He had to humble himself before the woman he had humiliated, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Pride doesn't give in without a fight. Each step toward repentance seemed heavier than the last. Still, something grew inside him. The certainty that he couldn't put it off forever. The woman's prayer was already bearing fruit, even without her knowing it. The repentance blossoming within her was a direct response to the words she had spoken to heaven, and soon this repentance would turn into action. The millionaire was ready for the next step, ready to face the greatest challenge of his life, asking for forgiveness, not as a rich man, but as a broken man. And deep down, he knew that this moment would change not only his life, but hers as well. His belated regret inevitably led to a reunion. My heart beat faster, my mind filled with doubts, but there was no turning back. The path was set, and the next step was inevitable, asking for forgiveness. It was a cold morning when he summoned his courage. The millionaire, now very different from before, walked slowly down the simple street where his wife lived. His heart was pounding, his hands were sweating. Each step seemed to weigh a ton. On the porch, she watered the flowers in the garden, the same garden he had so often overlooked as he drove past in his luxury car. Now, that simple setting seemed sacred. He took a deep breath, but his voice refused to come out. She noticed his presence, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The man who had once humiliated her was now there before her, but his eyes no longer held arrogance. They were tired, broken, and troubled. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. The words stuck in his throat were heavier than any $1 million contract he'd ever signed. So he did what he never thought he would. He fell to his knees before her. The scene was so unexpected that she dropped the watering can. Water splashed across the floor, but she didn't notice. She was shocked. The man who had once despised her was now there, begging for something no amount of money could buy: forgiveness. "I was wrong," he murmured, tears in his eyes. "I hurt her in front of everyone. I humiliated her. And since that day, I have had no peace." The words came broken by sobs. The mask of pride had fallen. She remained silent for a few seconds. Her racing heart reminded her of the pain she had felt. But she also remembered all the nights she had prayed for that moment. The request for forgiveness wasn't just for her. It was also God's answer. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he continued, his voice breaking. "But I must ask. must humble myself before you. I must confess that I was cruel, that I sinned against God and against you." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. She took a deep breath. The silence seemed eternal. The wind swayed the flowers in the garden, as if even nature itself awaited his answer. He remained on his knees, unconcerned about who might be watching from the street. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm but firm. "You hurt me, yes, but my heart no longer holds hate, because forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about who needs it, and you need it." His tears intensified. With each word, he felt as if invisible chains were being broken. It wasn't just her forgiveness that set him free. It was also God's forgiveness being manifested there. She reached out and helped him up. The simple gesture spoke louder than 1,000 words. It was as if she were saying, "Get up, because your life doesn't end here." He held her hand tightly, like a lifeline. "Thank you. Thank you for not rejecting me. I thought it would be too late." His voice still trembled, but there was palpable relief. She smiled tenderly. "It's never too late for those who truly seek. God always gives another chance." The words sank deep into his heart. For the first time in years, he felt hope. At that moment, some curious neighbors watched from afar. The scene was unimaginable. The most arrogant man in town, now on his knees before the simple woman. And suddenly, everyone understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. He wiped away the tears, but he couldn't hide his emotion. "I don't know how to make amends for what I did, but if you'll allow me, I want to start by helping, serving in any way I can." These weren't empty words. They were the fruit of a transformed heart. She simply replied, "What I want is for you to live differently. May your life be proof that God transforms even the most hardened of hearts." He nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. The scene didn't erase the humiliation she had suffered, but rather transformed it into testimony. The request for forgiveness wasn't just a reconciliation between two people. It was a clear sign that God's grace reaches everyone in that moment. He realized that no amount of wealth could compare to the value of forgiveness. The pride that had sustained him had crumbled, and in its place something new was born. Humility. She invited him in, offering him a glass of water. The simplicity of that gesture was more powerful than any banquet he had ever experienced, because at that simple table there was something he had never experienced: true welcome. Sitting in the wooden chair, he looked around. Family photographs, an open Bible, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. It was a world completely different from his own, but it held a richness he'd never known. "I don't deserve to be here," he said, looking around. She replied, with a smile no one does. "It's grace. It's a gift from God." Those words echoed within him, as if written on his heart. The conversation dragged on. He told her about his losses, about the restless nights, about how her memory never left his mind. She told him about her prayers, about how she asked God to touch his heart. That's when he realized she had already forgiven him long before that day. Regret didn't erase mistakes, but it paved the way for a fresh start. And in that fresh start, the millionaire discovered something he'd never known: inner peace. Before leaving, he firmly said, "I promise I'll live differently. I want to be living proof of what happened here today." She simply replied, "Let your actions speak for you." He walked down the street with slow steps, but his heart light. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. The weight of guilt had been lifted. The forgiveness he had received was like a new birth. And even if they didn't know it, that scene wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of a transformation that would impact not only their lives, but the entire city, because the apology made on bended knee had opened the door to something much greater, something no one could yet imagine. News of the apologies spread quickly throughout the city. It wasn't every day you saw a wealthy, once arrogant man kneeling before a simple woman. People talked about it in markets, bakeries, and churches. The event became a watershed moment. For many, it was shock. For others, it was hope, because if even he, known for his pride, had bowed, then any heart could change. The city saw not just the gesture, but the message behind it. She, in her simplicity, remained steadfast. She sought neither recognition nor glory. She knew that everything was the fruit of God's grace, but silently, she smiled at how her pain had transformed into living testimony. The millionaire, in turn, began to act differently. He visited humble people, discreetly helped families in need, and listened to stories he'd previously ignored. And each gesture wasn't for status, but because I wanted to live as proof of transformation. The greatest lesson was in every detail. Money, luxury, power, none of it was enough. True wealth lay in forgiveness, humility, and faith. Things you can't buy but receive when you open your heart. At church, the pastor used the story in a sermon. God can transform even the most hardened heart. Forgiveness frees not only the receiver, but also the giver. The people listened in silence, many with tears in their eyes. Some neighbors approached her and said, "We've never seen anything like this." She simply replied, "It was God. I just prayed," because she understood that the strength she had did not come from herself, but from above. The millionaire, now more human, began to share his story. He admitted his mistakes, spoke of the loneliness of luxury, and spoke of the day he fell to his knees. His vulnerability touched hearts that his former business speeches would never have touched. The greater lesson wasn't just the request for forgiveness, it was how such different worlds could meet in grace. The contrast between the mansion and the simple house now revealed a new meaning. It didn't matter where they came from, but where they were going. She continued her prayers, but now with a new tone, not just of intercession, but of gratitude. She knew that God had transformed a humiliation into a testimony that would impact generations. The entire city learned something. That pride destroys, but humility rebuilds. That invisible wounds can become scars of victory. And that, in the end, it's not money that defines value, but character shaped by God. Young people talked about it in schools. Older people remembered their own stories of forgiveness, and everyone in some way felt invited to reflect on their lives. Because that story wasn't just theirs. It was a mirror for everyone, she often said. Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's strength. And this phrase began to circulate around town. People who had previously held grudges began to reconsider. Doors that had previously been closed opened in families marked by long-standing feuds. The now transformed millionaire understood that his mission went beyond recovering businesses. His mission was to recover people, recover relationships, and recover himself. And it all began with the forgiveness he received that morning. Some still doubted, they thought it was just a phase, but time would show otherwise. Every action confirmed that the change was real. Arrogance had given way to humility. The greatest lesson was also in her heart. She didn't remain trapped in the past. She didn't let pain define her future. Forgiveness was like a key that opened doors to new chapters. At community meetings, many would say, if she could forgive, we can too. Her example was like a seed that germinated in many hearts. The transformation of one man generated transformation in many, and it wasn't just the city that learned. He learned from it too. He learned that dignity isn't found in expensive clothes, but in character. That greatness isn't found in wealth, but in knowing how to kneel when necessary. His belated repentance had become a living testimony, and each time he told his story, more people were touched. Not because he was a millionaire, but because he had been transformed. She, for her part, continued to live simply, but now her every gesture carried even more power. Her faith, her kindness, her serenity were constant reminders that God uses the little ones to teach the great. The millionaire began visiting nursing homes, children's shelters, and hospitals. Where before he saw only numbers, he now saw people. Every hug he received was more valuable than any profit, and the city began to change. The testimony of forgiveness and transformation created a wave of compassion. People who previously hadn't spoken began to reach out. Legacy. The greatest lesson wasn't just a man asking for forgiveness. It was how God used a simple, hurt, and humiliated woman to teach the entire city that nothing is impossible when there is faith. Days passed, but the memory of that apology didn't fade. On the contrary, it grew stronger. At family dinners, in church services, and even in sidewalk conversations, she knew there were still challenges ahead. But she also knew that each challenge was an opportunity for God to show his power, and this filled her with hope. He, on the other hand, carried a new weight. No longer the weight of guilt, but the weight of responsibility. Now needed to honor the forgiveness he had received. The city would never be the same again. Because when pride falls and humility rises, something changes not just in individuals, but in entire communities, and in everyone's hearts. The same phrase echoed, if even he has changed, then there is hope for all of us. The greatest lesson had been learned, but there was still one final chapter. A new beginning was about to emerge from this transformation. The city's days returned to their usual rhythm, but there was something different in the air. It was as if everyone breathed a new hope. The apology hadn't just changed to lives, had lit a collective flame. The simple woman continued her routine. She picked flowers in the garden, prepared meals, prayed at dawn, but now every gesture seemed charged with a greater meaning. She knew her life had become a living testimony. The millionaire, in turn, discovered a whole new world. He no longer sought applause, but real encounters. With every sincere conversation, with every helping hand, he felt a joy he had never known at luxurious banquets. In the square, the same place of humiliation, different scenes now unfolded. Children played, families gathered, and he often appeared to chat with residents, not as a powerful man but as an ordinary neighbor. The contrast between past and present was glaring. Those who once walked with their heads held high in pride, now walked with humility, and those who once bore scars in silence, now exuded victory in every look. Some began to call her a woman of prayer. He came to be seen as the transformed man. New labels emerged, not for status but for testimony. The whole town sensed something powerful had happened at her home. Her grandchildren would ask, "Grandma, was it true that he knelt?" She would smile and say, "Yes, he did, because God can change even the hardest hearts." Listened attentively, learning early about grace and forgiveness. His mansion, which had once seemed cold, now echoed with laughter. He opened his doors to welcome guests, share meals, and listen to stories. The once ostentatious space had become a place of communion. The newspapers wrote about him again, but this time not about business or downfalls. They spoke of transformation, humility, and service to the community. And this change even inspired neighboring towns. She, however, did not let herself be carried away by sudden fame. She remained the same, simple, discreet, firm in her faith. God's work, not hers. This silent recognition was her greatest greatness. He sought to learn. He read the Bible, attended services, and listened to counsel. Every verse seemed written especially for him, and with each page he discovered that the true treasure lay, not in coffers but in eternal promises. The community also grew stronger. Previously distant neighbors grew closer. Divided families reconciled. The example of forgiveness and repentance spread like a chain of love in her heart. There was gratitude, not only for being honored, but for seeing the power of prayer transform even the improbable. Her faith, which had sustained days of pain, now sustained days of victory. He began serving quietly. He visited hospitals, brought supplies to needy families, and helped young people study. He didn't need to advertise anything. His testimony spoke for itself. The city would never be the same, and neither would they. The encounter that began in humiliation had turned into rebirth. It was a new beginning for everyone. A reporter once asked her what she felt when the millionaire knelt. She simply replied, "I felt that God is faithful. He always keeps his promises." The answer touched even the most skeptical hearts. In his heart, there were still scars. But now, they were memories he never wanted to return to. Regret had become fuel for a different life. The children in town played millionaire, asking for forgiveness. An innocent game, but full of meaning. Even the little ones had already understood the greater lesson. Pride brings down, humility raises. She went about her life without any major external changes. A miracle. A peace that came not from profit, but from forgiveness. And this discovery was the foundation of his new life. Their lesson didn't end there, because with each person who heard the story, a new cycle began, and each cycle generated further transformation. In the end, they both understood something profound. It wasn't just about a man who fell to his knees. It was about a God who stooped to lift two hearts. The city learned that greatness lies not in how much one has, but in how much one gives, and that forgiveness is the greatest treasure anyone can offer. She continued to pray, knowing that new struggles would come, but she also knew that, with faith, each struggle would turn into victory, and that was enough to move forward in peace. He continued his journey, knowing that each day was a chance to begin again. The past no longer held him captive. The future lay open before him, and so a new story began to be written. A story of faith, forgiveness, and hope. A story no one could have predicted, but one everyone needed to hear, because in the end, what seemed like the final chapter was just a prologue. Life still had much to reveal, and both were ready to live each new day with purpose. The new beginning wasn't just theirs, it was for everyone who witnessed it, because when God transforms a heart, he transforms everything around it. And so, silently, without fanfare, life went on. But nothing would ever be the same again. Pride had fallen, and in its place, humility flourished. It was the end of a journey. But at the same time, it was just the beginning of something bigger, full of hope. Have you noticed how, from a cruel humiliation, a story of transformation was born? How many times in your life have you also carried invisible wounds, waiting for someone to recognize your worth? Maybe this story stirred something inside you, right? What touches me most is that God used the unlikely. A simple, silent woman, full of faith, was instrumental in transforming the most hardened heart in the city. This isn't just about them. It's also about me, about you, about all of us. And I ask you, have you ever felt the weight of needing to forgive someone, or felt the weight of needing to ask for forgiveness? How would you have acted if you were in their shoes? What if you were in their shoes? These answers can change the way you live from now on. Perhaps this is the time to reflect. What new beginning is God preparing for you? Because life always offers us this opportunity, and often, it begins in the silence of prayer and the humble gesture of forgiveness. Asterisk, if this story touched your heart, I invite you to join me. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future stories. Here, each narrative is an invitation to reflect, feel, and perhaps transform your own life.